We'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome back, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you all back after the break. Today, we are delighted to have a wonderful speaker join us here at the Iran Center. Golnar Nikpour is assistant professor at Dartmouth University in the Department of History. She's a scholar of Iranian political and intellectual history and a scholar of carcerality, of prison studies, and gender studies, international human rights. It's really a delight to have her here. She's going to be sharing some of her recent scholarship, which will soon see the light of day as her first book is on the horizon. So a lot to look forward to with today's talk. Before we all went home for the break, we had a talk about the World Cup, and I know many of us have been watching very avidly the events of those games. Here, I would also like to highlight Professor Nikpour's recent op-ed in the New York Times about the Iranian participation in the World Cup. And anyone who hasn't seen that article yet, I encourage you guys to go to the Times to get something of a counterpoint and another perspective from the events that we were discussing a couple of weeks ago. I won't take too much longer of your time in introducing Professor Nikpour, but just a few words. We'll, of course, have time for questions and answers after today's talk. If you want to get on the list of people asking questions, catch my eye, and I'll get you on the list. Like always, I ask that you keep the questions short, maybe to around a minute, and make them, questions and try to keep the questions singular. One more word probably doesn't need to be said, but we would very much like it if you refrain from recording the presentations. They're already being recorded and will be made available on the web. So anyone who wants to have a record of things that are said in these meetings, we encourage you guys to visit the web recording there. Without any further ado, though, I'm really excited for today's talk. It promises to be wonderful. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nikpour.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really excited to have an opportunity to share my work with everybody, and I want to thank in particular Behruz Qamari Tabrizi and everyone at the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for asking me to be here today, and thank you in particular to Becky Parnian for her help organizing my visit. It's an honor to have the opportunity to present my work, and it's been really nice working with everybody at the center who've made me feel very much at home here today. Okay, so my talk today is drawn largely from my forthcoming book manuscript, which is called The Incarcerated Modern: Prisons and Public Life in Iran. And I'm going to talk a little bit about basically the arguments in that book and give us a few examples of the materials that I look at. So my work traces the transformation of Iran from a decentralized empire with few imprisoned persons at the turn of the 20th century into a modern state with a vast prison network with well over 250,000 prisoners in today's Islamic Republic of Iran. How and why did this massive reordering of the social over the course of just a century happen? How did Iranians come to understand their increasingly surveilled and punished social worlds and public lives? And what, if anything, does Iran's carceral history tell us about the expansion of modern prisons around the globe at the same time? So the book from which this talk is drawn analyzes an expansive, multilingual, interdisciplinary archive with materials that I've culled from private and public archives in Iran, in Europe, across the United States. So if anyone is curious about where any of this came from, I would love to answer questions to that end. But the work, the sort of principal aim of the work is to explore the interplay between the concrete space of the Iranian prison and the historical role of these new prisons in producing new public cultures and political languages. So prisons in Iran today have an unhappy global reputation, to say the least. Even those with cursory knowledge of Iranian politics have heard troubling accounts of arbitrary arrest, torture, and extrajudicial violence in today's Islamic Republic. As we know, this has been again proven true over the course of the last several weeks, where thousands of protesters have been arrested over several weeks of protest in the country. But given this grim international reputation, it might surprise those outside of Iran to know that the Islamic Republic has also long used Iran's prisons as proof of not its illegitimacy, but its moral and political legitimacy. Now, of course, the main historical story that Iran's current government tells, that it tells about prisons is quite different than the one told by its critics. Now, for the Islamic Republic, the revolution in 1979 represents an unequivocal break with the brutality of the Pahlavi monarchy. So, reminding Iranians of the spectacular violence of Iran's pre-revolutionary prisons is something of a cottage industry for the contemporary government and for high-ranking officials in the government. So you'll see things like books that are published by government institutions, members of the state who were in prison before the revolution tell and retell those stories with great regularity. So there is very much a kind of narrative that is preferred and told. And of course, some of the prisons of the former government, of the monarchy, have been institutionalized, reimagined as museums. So reminding Iranians of the spectacular violence of Iran's pre-revolutionary prisons is something of a cottage industry, as I said, just as downplaying the Islamic Republic's own record of carceral violence has long been those same officials' modus operandi. But despite this present-day struggle over Iran's carceral record, over Iran's carceral history, over the importance of 1979, of how we understand the history of Iranian prisons, Iran's modern prison system has its institutional origins much earlier in the early part, the first half of the 20th century. It is this making and establishing of the modern carceral state, as well as transformations in Iranian social worlds and political vocabularies, with which my project is centrally concerned. So I look at three distinct historical periods, and for those of you who are familiar with Iranian history, this will be material you already know. But at the same time, I think it's important to highlight that the work is trying to trace both continuities and ruptures across these distinct periods, right? So we have the Qajar, the Pahlavi, and the Islamic Republic eras. I begin in the late Qajar era, with a decentralized state where imprisonment is relatively rare, where long imprisonment is virtually unheard of. Move through the Pahlavi period, where it's a period of legal centralization and expansion from dozens to tens of thousands of detainees. And on the eve of the revolution, the best numbers we have is that there were there's some changes that happen in prisons and who's in there in the last few months before the revolution. But the kind of high point before the revolution, it's about 20,000 incarcerated people, 20 to 25,000, depending on, we don't have perfect numbers, but that's kind of where I fall in based on the material that I have. After 1979, we again have a continued massive expansion of the prison system, where now there are officially 250,000 plus total detainees. And of course, that doesn't include certain populations of incarcerated dissidents who are not counted by the prisons organization. They're under different sort of jurisdiction. And it doesn't count all pre-trial detainees. It doesn't count, for instance, migrants who are captured. So this is at the very minimum number of people who are incarcerated. It's what the government says their incarcerated numbers are. But basically every government undersells how many people they have in detention at any given point. So my book ends by looking at what I call carcerality beyond the prison in the Islamic Republic. That is, the expansion of non-prison forms of punishment, things like electronic ankle monitors, biometric surveillance, what prison scholars have called prison by another name. I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but I'm happy to go into that if people are curious in the Q&A. So I'm going to quickly, in a moment, get to a couple of examples from my research, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the arguments that I make in the book. And my first argument is actually quite simple. This change over 100 years, the making of the modern prison system in Iran, has led to an elemental and enduring transformation in Iranian life. This has dramatically shifted what Iranians experience, what people in Iran experience as sort of day-to-day social worlds, right? This transformation didn't happen in isolation. It's not an Iranian story only, but it's part of a global trend, really, in an era that saw the mass promotion and entrenching of carceral solutions In other words, surveillance, policing, criminalization, punishment, imprisonment, to a wide host of social issues. It's really difficult to overstate how important this change has been. Now, for most of Iran's long pre-20th century history, forced confinement, as I said, was relatively rare, and long periods of incarceration were virtually non-existent. This is not to say that there was never any jailing. Of course, there were scattered jails, dungeons did exist in the country. There's a tradition of prison poetry in the medieval period. But these spaces were neither systematized nor capable of holding large numbers of people long-term. That wasn't their sort of goal. The prison, then, is a fundamentally modern institution, what historian Frank de Cotter has, in the Chinese context, called a cathedral of modernity. So in the book, I chart the history of modern surveillance, punishment, and incarceration, that constellation of techniques and institutions of modern power, foundational to the carceral state, and argue that far from being simply a site of private suffering, the Iranian carceral system has become a generative public locus for questions of citizenship, rights, and political belonging and unbelonging. But here, a further explanation on what I mean by the public life of the prison is in order. So the book is called The Incarcerated Modern Prisons and Public Life in Iran, and I'd like to explain briefly what I mean by public life. Now, I use that phrase in two linked sense. The first is perhaps a bit more immediately evident. It means it's the public conversations that the new legal system and the new prison system elicited. So questions on law, justice, and punishment that are sort of produced in this moment of legal and carceral centralization. As some of us may know, the central topics of this book, prisons and punishment in Iran, have been subjects of great significance to Iranians. Seemingly, the moment plans for new modern prisons in Iran were formulated in the 1910s and 20s, Iranians were talking about those prisons, as well as the forms of mass surveillance and policing that came with that project. Iranians had to learn en masse how not to get arrested and incarcerated. This is something that we all actually have to know and understand as sort of modern subjects in the surveillance state. We all can actually imagine a world where we go outside, and if our goal was to get arrested, we could comport ourselves along those lines, because we understand that. So that means that we're all comporting ourselves all the time so as not to get arrested, right? We don't think about it that way. It's totally naturalized. But if you can imagine trying to break that and go out into the world and you want to get arrested and you can do certain things to do that, then that means that you know what not to do, right? So people had to learn en masse how to newly comport themselves. Like many people all over the world, Iranians did this through these new popular genres, things like prison memoirs, academic criminology and penology, newspaper accounts of crime, and of course, most visibly, face-to-face interactions with these new institutions of policing and incarceration. Now, of course, the modern prison system has also been foundational for political movements. One of the things I talk about in my book is political, what we think of as political prisoners. Iranian dissidents have written on, organized activism around, produced art and literature about their relationship to prisons and imprisonment. Dissident parties have been formed. So they're inside of prisons. Political movements have been launched from inside of prisons. Virtually every important modern Iranian political movement has produced critical work from and about carceral confinement. That these movements have theorized and called for liberation from the context of modern confinement is, I argue, reflective of the modern prison's public life. But I want to make it clear that the public life of the prison is not simply what dissident Iranians have said or thought in response to carceral practices. Now, of course, it includes that, but I argue that these linked systems of surveillance, policing, punishment, and incarceration, the sort of carceral state, have transformed all Iranian social worlds and public life, not just those of the most politically engaged. My argument is not merely that modern carcerality produced new public cultures in Iran, though of course it did, but rather that modern forms of incarceration shape the very notion of the public and of membership in that public. So this is the second sense in which I theorize the public life of the prison. Throughout the book, I argue that in drawing, redrawing, and policing the line between the bad criminal and the good citizen, the carceral techniques of the modern state have broadly shaped Iranian notions of citizenship and those who don't belong to the citizenship polity, of freedom and unfreedom, of nationalized inclusion and exclusion. So, labeling its expansion of prisons and prison factories social work, for instance, the mid-20th century Pahlavi government argued that the expanded prisons were necessary to, quote, train and educate deviant Iranians so they could live nobly as productive citizens. Their very ability to function as citizens was, in these state discourses, premised on the expansion of the carceral state. The government touted the rehabilitative capacity of these prisons. So the names of these prisons that were actually relatively new at the time were changed in the 1960s to reflect this impulse. The Central Prison for Men and Women, Zendan Markazi Mardan Zanan, was changed to the Penitentiary for Men and Women, so Nedamatgah. While some prisons stopped using the word Zendan, prison, altogether, and instead started to call themselves Andarzgah, or place of counsel. So this pedagogical project has continued, albeit in different ideological dressing, in the Islamic Republic. If you go to the Prisons Organization website of the Islamic Republic, they routinely refer to prisons as Amuzeshgah Niki, virtue training schools. The Islamic Republic has promoted its prisons as necessary spaces in the transformation of antisocial or deviant elements into ethical modern Islamic citizens. So in other words, the public life of the prison also refers to the way that carceral practices and institutions have shaped ideas of national belonging, as I said, social deviance, healthy citizenship, but even Islamic ethics in the post-revolutionary period. As the numbers of detainees have increased throughout the period that I have up here, both the Pahlavi government and the Islamic Republic, despite their apparent political differences, have routinely promised that prisons would render Iranian citizens safer by sequestering and also simultaneously reforming criminals into citizens. And this process has been marked by a turn towards what I call the carceral imagination, a way of seeing the world in such a way where policing and incarceration of large numbers of people is viewed as not only normal, but inherent to the project of progress, modernity, humanity. And really, this is a point I cannot emphasize enough, that both the pre- and post-revolutionary governments talk about their prisons as a way to make the country better, as a way to make it more humane, as a way to make it more progressive, as a way to reform, to make it truly modern. This language is used both in the pre-revolutionary period and in the post-revolutionary period. I find that extremely important. So even as Iran has undergone political upheavals at the highest levels, coups, revolutions, occupations, the carceral institutions and imaginaries inaugurated at the turn of the century have not only remained in place, but expanded. So there's one last sort of point that I try to make in the book that I want to emphasize here, which is that the work is on Iran. I mean, the research is on the prisons in Iran, but for me, it's extremely crucial that to understand modern prisons as a foundationally global, modern carcerality is a foundationally global project, right? Modern carcerality, I argue, is a truly world-spanning and world-making phenomenon. We cannot study the history of the prison from sort of one-by-one case studies or from sort of thinking of them as peripheral or exceptional, thinking of the Iranian prison as peripheral or exceptional. The architectures, economies, and techniques of modern punishment are transnational and linked. So even in places that are imagined to be politically opposed, like Iran, contemporary Islamic Republic, and the US, are in fact operating from the same carceral blueprints. For instance, Mashhad, Iran, and Marion, Illinois. So several prisons in the contemporary Islamic Republic of Iran were built just before the revolution from blueprints from USP Marion in Illinois, now a part of the US federal supermax system. And USP Marion was built virtually at the same time as these Iranian prisons, as both systems experimented with confining and controlling troubled populations. These blueprints were used all over the world. This model was used all over the world, revealing the fully global scope of these carceral logics and architectures, and undercutting arguments that would claim that the Islamic Republic prisons have no analogs anywhere else in the world. We have to think about both their sort of global position and their local specificity together. And without a transnational approach, links like this disappear into the historical ether. Now I'm going to now go into a couple more examples from my work. The book itself actually has chapters both on what we think of as political prisoners and what in the Iranian context are called ordinary prisoners, zandaniya adi. And I make a broader argument in the book that to sort of ask us or invite us to think about everybody who's captured in the modern carceral state in the sort of mass incarceration project that Iran has undertaken as political prisoners of a kind, in the sense that they are prisoners they have been imprisoned due to political decisions, right? So today I'm not going to be talking so much about the political dissidence side of that, although several chapters in the book are devoted to it. So I can go more into how I kind of think these links, what I think of these links, or what I do in terms of dissidence in the Q&A if people are interested. For my part, I want to talk a little bit more about the sort of reformist promise at the heart of these new prisons, right? That they are inaugurated with a reformist promise and that they continue to sort of have this reformist pretense. So let me turn to the late Qajar period that I begin with. In the summer of 1895, an Iranian man identified only as Sadouk in the British Colonial Archive attacked his employer, a British man by the name of Mr. Tanfield, in his bed with a sword. Now, according to Tanfield's account, the enmity between Sadouk and Tanfield began when Tanfield fired Sadouk for allegedly stealing a watch, money, and liquor. Now, Tanfield was employed by a private British firm called Lynch & Company, which had been granted a minor concession by the Shah in 1888 to run a line of steamers. And these concessions, as we know, were extraordinarily unpopular. This wasn't one of the big ones, but it was still an important one. Now, the lopsided terms of these colonial deals famously elicited mass mobilizations by broad cross-sections of Iranians at the dawning of the 20th century. The big responses to these, the big sort of politically aware responses to these, the tobacco revolt, the constitutional movement, have been understood as the first modern protest movements in Iranian history. These events were of not only local, but eventually national and even world historical significance. But beyond these mass movements, the presence of these British concessionaires and colonial officers also elicited intimate and quotidian violence like this Tanfield incident, which have largely been lost to history. Now, Tanfield awoke to find the sword-wielding Sadouk perched on top of him, but evidently managed to fend off a would-be death blow. He escaped with his life, though he lost his hand. The account is actually quite riveting. When Tanfield was carried to the river to be taken away for medical care, crowds of locals gathered and celebrated his injuries. Now, in a report to his superiors, J.F. White, the assistant political agent for Her Britannic Majesty's consul, was apoplectic. White claimed that the Qajars seemed not to grasp that their inaction toward known criminals was a problem. Because of the inactivity of the local authorities, White wrote, quote, "There has been another attack upon an Englishman who has been dreadfully wounded and disfigured. I have tried in vain to get the would-be murderer punished, but nothing whatsoever has been done. The mob hooted and stoned Mr. Tanfield, but the local authorities have taken no notice of this brutal demonstration." Now, obviously, the Colonial Archive doesn't capture the voices or opinions of these Iranian townspeople who were Tanfield's neighbors, but their sentiments towards the colonial presence, I argue, is nonetheless pretty clear. It doesn't take a master of reading against the colonial grain to notice that they don't view these incidents as representative of unchecked criminality, which is what the British constantly are saying about them, but rather as kind of anti-colonial catharsis, a reason to get together and cheer in the face of foreign intrusion, etc. But a seeming paradox emerges at this moment in the Colonial Archive. Now, although European accounts painted Qajar officials as ruthless, despotic, absolutist, European demands were actually for more rather than less punishment, more rather than less policing, more rather than less surveillance. So the Qajars are presented as these kind of quintessential Oriental despots, but they're also presented as lawless, not present, anarchic, right? So this is kind of paradox that emerges from the point of view of the European archive. Now, it is in this era that modernist Iranian reformers and statesmen themselves became extraordinarily invested in questions of law and legality, as well as a kind of side to that in techniques of policing and punishment. Now, this investment in the law, what Hadi Enayat has called the legal fetishism of Qajar intellectuals, would have increasingly carceral manifestations as Qajar and later Pahlavi reformists came to see the modern prison as necessary first steps in Iran's civilizational leap forward into global modern nationhood. Now, reformist pressures pushed the Qajars to making some limited law enforcement reforms, particularly in Tehran. In 1878, Nasiruddin Shah created the nation's first European-style police force, hiring the Italian-born Austrian, the Conte Monteforte, as an advisor. With the Count de Monteforte's arrival, a police form, the Nazmiya, was officially formed. It was small in strength and number, ranging from 250 to 300 or 400 members over the next couple of decades. But still, de Monteforte, who was eventually made chief of police, took steps towards reorganizing police in the capital city, writing police codes, standardizing uniforms to look like those in Vienna, and seeking the further expansion of the capital city's law enforcement capacities. After the constitutional era, the Qajar government brought in Swedish officers in 1912. Now, over 10 years, the Swedes worked to expand the Tehran police force and introduce some basics of European evidentiary norms. 13 years later, a League of Nations report claimed that the Tehran police force was approximately 1,000 members strong. So we see this sort of slow but steady expansion. Now, the Swedish officers, we know there's been others who've written about these police reforms, but they also oversaw the building of a nascent prison network in Tehran's Tubkhane Square, a location that until recently had been used for public whippings and executions. The prisons established in their era, small by later standards, included the notorious, if generically named, Prison Number 1 and Prison Number 2. And Prison Number 1 was particularly notorious among those who were held there for its dark imprisonment, which Ardeshir Ovanesyan of the Iranian Communist Party likened to being buried alive. And this was part of a small carceral network that was built by the Swedish officers, including a small interrogation center, a temporary holding facility, the central police jail, and the first dedicated women's jailing facility in Iranian history. The women's facility would remain the main women's prison well into the Pahlavi era, though women in this point also began to be held in police jails in other big cities. So other big cities didn't necessarily have dedicated women's jailing facilities, but they would hold women when they were arrested. Swedish officers also changed the culture found inside of Qajar jails, including ending the practice of putting chains around the neck. So this is an image from Lake Qajar prison. This is from a postcard that I found that has, I'm not sure, it's sometime from just after the 20th century, but I don't know the specific year. But this is the sort of the practice of putting chains around the neck and blocks around the legs of detainees. Prisoners beginning in the 1910s were newly made to wear standard issue uniforms modeled on those found in European prisons. These would be used well into the Pahlavi period. So this is an image from the Reza Shah era, so a little bit after what I'm talking about. But this is gives you a sense of the change and the move towards a kind of standardized dress code for detainees. And these were big changes, but they're pretty small compared to what is the wholesale changes that are about to happen. Yeah, and I found this image in the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Iranian History archives, which is in Tehran. Now, in 1925, Reza Khan is crowned Reza Shah, the first Pahlavi Shah. That year, members of the Iranian police force, the one that we've just been talking about, the Tehran police force, traveled to the International Penal and Penitentiary Conference in London. Now, this commission, the International Penal and Penitentiary Commission, was initially formed in 1872 with the mandate to collect prison statistics and recommend prison reforms all over the world. 1925 was the first time an Iranian delegation participated in an IPC conference, although there had been correspondence between the Qajar government and the IPC in earlier years. Now, for Sir Evelyn Ruggles Breese, British president of the IPC, The work of the commission was no less than an undertaking in the service of civilization and humanity. On the eve of the conference, Ruggles-Breese boasted that the commission was, quote, a confederation of the most civilized states of the world, working quietly and unostentatiously to introduce greater humanity to punishment systems around the world. Ruggles-Breese claimed that the commission was torchbearers, quote, for a world desire for a rational and equitable system of punishment, end quote. Now, for Ruggles-Breese, this world desire was itself, quote, due to the progressive widening of the circle of humanity. So you have this kind of imaginary where not all people are in the circle of humanity. They're in some sort of like somehow outside of that circle. For Ruggles-Breese, these insights highlighted the interconnected stakes of his work. He noted recent successes in prison reform in Japan and Siam, and credited the commission for bringing statesmen from around the world to promote the, quote, continental system of prison administration. He said, he wrote that year, members of different nations breathing in the same civilizing atmosphere come to regard each other as compatriotes sociaux in the work of humanity. I can't pronounce French words, so I'm sorry about that. Leading to reforms that would reduce criminal behavior the world over. And for the IPC, the London conference was an important step towards bringing new participants, Pahlavi Iran included, into that civilizing atmosphere. Now, the insights gleaned from this conference would influence the building of new Iranian prisons, including the sort of major 20th century prison in Iran, Qasr prison, which was partly, the architecture of that prison was partly sort of imagined from some of the insights that these Iranian officials got while at this conference. Now, 2 years later, in 1927, Reza Shah appointed Minister of Justice Ali Akbar Davar to lead the judiciary. Davar dissolves the existing judiciary and undertakes a complete overhaul of the standing piecemeal legal codes. Now, this wholesale centralization of Iran's legal system was coterminous with the establishment of an expansive modern prison system. So the sort of small prison system that I discussed was, it's just in Tehran. It's mostly pretty small still. And even into the late 1920s, the number of people who were held in prisons in Tehran were numbered, according to the police journals, only 300 or 400 people. So even at this point, we're not talking about a huge number of people. As I said, the most famous of the new prisons that were built in this time was Qasr. Now, Qasr opened in 1929. Pahlavi Iran intended it to be the crown jewel of its new penal system, proof to the world that it was a civilized modern state. They were proud of this prison. Later statesman Ahmad Houman later boasted that with Qasr, Iran had finally built a prison that would hold prisoners, quote, without any sort of class distinctions. Yet despite these high hopes, the prison immediately became an object of criticism, as it seemed to almost instantly reveal the limits of Pahlavi legal reformism and prison reformism rather than its successes. Now, Qasr has again been remade, this time as a museum commemorating the violence of the Pahlavi era. So if you go to Tehran, you can visit Qasr. It has a lot of extremely interesting and occasionally historically incorrect signage. But it's one of a couple of very, very interesting prison museums that are in Tehran at the time. And here's a picture I took the first time I went there. There's a really nice park. When I was there was like many people having picnics in this prison park, which seemed rather gloomy to me, but anyway, so despite, as I said, this promise of this new institution, it had become this object of criticism right away. One example of this criticism was, of these sorts of critiques, was an expose written in 1946 after the sort of forced abdication of Reza Shah and the coming to power of his son. This kind of open moment where there's some relatively open publishing, and a book comes out called "Come With Me to Prison" by Hedayatollah Hakim Elahi, an Oxford-educated journalist, Islamic humanist, and critic of the government. Now, Hakim Elahi dedicated the book to prisoners whose only crime has been poverty and lack of power, and that's a quote. And the book gestures to a growing anxiety among Iranians of the day that Tehran, with its prisons, asylums, brothels, was not only the capital of Iranian statecraft, but also its capital of sin and vice. Now, this echoed a growing public anxiety about the apparent rise in female criminality. Hakim Elahi tells readers that many of the women's prison have young children in tow. There's pictures to go with that, while others have kids at home who are basically being left unattended. There are other similar critiques that are circulating in this mid-century period, like documentarian Kamran Shirdel, who made a documentary in 1965 called The Women's Prison, that is similarly sort of worried about what's happening to the kids of these prisoners. Now, in their emphasis on broken families and imprisoned children, critiques such as these challenged these institutions using a long-standing discourse of Iranian nationalism, patriotic motherhood. Instead of raising the next generation of healthy citizens, Iranian women are raising the next generation of recidivists, according to these critiques. Now, Hakim Elahi says something, he's critical of the Pahlavi government, but he's critical of the modernizing state, but he's not an anti-modernist. He argues instead that the Pahlavi government needs to do something productive with these people. If it's going to arrest people and put them in prison, something productive has to happen with them. Now, this would be precisely the project that the government takes up in the next few years. The ideas that the government draws on, though, come from a budding field of the mid-20th century academic criminology. By the 1950s, there's a budding interest in what's called ilm-e-zindan, or prison sciences, in Iran's universities. This is at a time when, basically in 1946, the first sociology course was offered at Tehran University's Teachers College, and by the 1950s, there's interest in criminology and so forth as well. Now, one illustrative text is a 1950s doctoral thesis by Abul Hassan Behpour from Tehran University's law school called Prisons and Prisoners. Now, from what I've found, this is the first monograph-length work exclusively on prisons written in Persian by an Iranian. In this text, Behpour proposes a telos that would become the sort of guiding telos of criminologists at this time and of the Pahlavi government, which is that the history of punishment, and this would be familiar to anyone who knows about European criminology, which is like where this is largely drawn from. That the history of punishment is a progressive march from the inefficient and inhumane towards the useful and just. Behpour writes, in prisons of old, so much did they torture that prisoners would be forced to confess whether or not they had committed a crime. But today in Iran, he writes, punishments are applied with regard to the law. Now, despite his triumphalism, Pahlavi prisons emerge in his text, in Behpour's text, as sites of anxiety. Behpour notes, for instance, that these prisons lagged behind those of other progressive nations in terms of prisoner health. Now, from its inception, Iranian criminology leaned heavily on the language of the medical sciences and eventually the language of psychology and psychotherapy. So pre-revolutionary Iran's, one of pre-revolutionary Iran's foremost criminologists, prison reform advocates, and sometimes instructor at Tehran's police academy, Taj Zamandanesh, argues in her extremely influential monograph called ilm-e-zindan. She argues that the criminal is like a patient. And just as a doctor orders tests on the patient in order to diagnose their disease, the judge must collect information on the personality of each offender in order to discover the reasons for their crimes. Now, Danish was an academic criminologist, but she also was sometimes an instructor at the police academy. And her book, a kind of abbreviated version of it, was actually a major textbook for new police recruits. So you start to see this sort of, these are folks who are academics, but they're working really closely with the government on prison administration and on policing. Now, this wasn't the only link between police training and the newly sort of budding field of criminology, the technocratic field of criminology. The National Police Department would build a small museum of criminology, which was built for cadets to learn about fingerprinting techniques and scientific police methods, and to, quote, see paraphernalia used in committing various crimes in Iran. By the mid-1960s, the National Police Bureau of Identification held a repository with, quote, over 5 million photographs and fingerprints classified according to the Henry system on file. That's the mid-1960s. So we're talking about a quick sort of expansion of the state's interest and ability to surveil people along sort of the newly available technologies. In Danish's work, as in other key criminological texts, modern surveillance state is cast as a healer. It's not a surveillance state, it's a healer, reformer of individual prisoner pathologies. So for these criminologists, and increasingly for the government, social ills are increasingly subjected to carceral logics. In other words, modern prisons are recast as therapeutic institutions that could cure social ailments. Now, the government, in 1954, the Iranian cabinet, approved funding for the Institute for the Cooperation and Industry of Prisoners. With backing from another state institution, the Organization for the Protection of Prisoners, the institute initiated massive prison labor programs. Over the course of the next several years, the institute built factories in both men's and women's prisons in Qasr and in other prisons in the country, with workstations for sewing, metalworks, furniture building, so many more things. By 1965, so a decade later, there were at least 30 skilled technicians in Qasr prison factory who taught classes and worked in a management capacity. At that point, it was estimated that there was about 1,000 incarcerated workers who were in the prison work program, 850 or so of whom were men, 95 women, and about 50 youths. Now, the Institute credited its founding to the progressive nature of Mohammad Reza Shah. And increasingly after 1963, these reforms were situated in the broader context of the White Revolution. But as we see, they actually predate the White Revolution. In 1965, National Chief of Police Major General Mohsen Mobassar gives a speech where you can really see the way in which academic discourses have totally seeped into the logic of the way that these government institutions and law enforcement officers are talking about prisons. So Mobassar, he's National Chief of Police, but his office also oversees the entire country's prison system. And he says we need to be attendant to criminology because the dialectical method, and this is a quote, the dialectical method, the chief of police states, teaches us that every phenomenon must be studied in a state of flux, transformation, and evolution. Every time I read that, I think about an American police officer talking about the dialectical method, and it makes it extra funny for me. So Mobassar goes on. He says he uses the same sort of logic that you find in some of the criminological texts, and he says that the goal of the new prison system is to punish proportionately to crime. So this proportionate theory of punishment is sort of introduced here. The goal of punishment, he says, in earlier society was only retribution, and thus punishments were inhumane. Not only wasn't any positive result achieved, but the vengeful atmosphere also led to committing worse and more horrific crimes. Every day, criminality increased in terms of both quality and quantity. Now, this economy of criminality becomes a core rhetorical ideal to not only Pahlavi carceral thinking, but Islamic Republic carceral thinking. So you see the same sort of language used in the post-revolutionary period, that punishments have to be proportionate to their crime. And in the Islamic Republic period, you'll get these arguments that that's why Islam and Islamic law is the most just system, because sort of God has ordained what the most just punishments for specific crimes are. Mobassar essentially argues that Pahlavi-built prisons would help eradicate, or at least radically reduce, crime in Iran. Prisons had to be built and filled in this logic for prisons to not be needed at some future date. Now, Mobassar wasn't the only member of the Pahlavi elite to spread this rehabilitative message. No less a personage than Queen Farah remarked in 1968, "Most prisoners are capable of reform and cultivation, tarbiyat, and are regretful of their criminal actions." In other words, Pahlavi prisons were spaces where the incarcerated were sent, the Queen says, as punishment, not for punishment. But by what mechanism did the Pahlavi government suggest reforming these prisoners? The answer was labor. So all of the new prisons that are built in the 50s, 60s, and increasingly into the 70s specifically have these massive prison labor programs. So Ghazal Hisar prison, about 11 miles from Tehran, which opened its doors in 1868, was claimed by the Tehran Police Journal, which doesn't call Qezal Hisar a prison. It refers to it only as a work and training center. So if you didn't know, you would think it was like a voluntary program. As I mentioned earlier, there are these 2 new prisons built in this era, 2,000 capacity facilities in Mashhad and Shiraz based on Marion Penitentiary in Illinois. Now I want to dwell for just one moment on the link to USB Marion before kind of starting to wrap up a little bit. USB Marion includes, when it was built in the 60s, basically at the same time as these prisons in Iran, it included these novel experiments in forms of solitary confinement and in forms of group therapy in which prisoners were made to express penitence. These prisons were used all over the world, in Iran, Israel, UK, New Zealand, and many other locations. Now, in 1975, the government further turned these reforms into a mandated prison policy with a new prison code. So it starts to use the sort of logics that are the labor, these penitent models, these certain forms of solitary confinement in this new prison code. Now, as a result of this code, detainees under the age 30 were required to participate in vocational training and daily physical exercise. Now, this would be true for the sort of so-called ordinary prisoners, right? That's who I'm talking about. Now, this code was never taken off the books, so it remains on the books virtually as is in the post-revolutionary period. The only sort of meaningful change is that one of alongside vocational education, Islamic education was added to the curriculum. Now, I want to briefly situate these reforms in the context of the post-coup moment, because I think we have an understanding broadly that that Iranian intelligence really expands at this moment, this sort of Savak being trained by the CIA, and we know that there's this increased surveillance of political dissidents. But it's not only political dissidents who experience the impacts of US-trained militarized policing. In 1959, the US Army sent a mission led by Colonel Charles McLean Peake to Iran to oversee reforms to the gendarmerie and to the prison system. And he worked with the National Police Force and with Mobassar in particular. And he remarkably presents his efforts and aims in Iran in the same language that marked this rhetoric. So he talks about humane reforms. He talks about sort of reform of the prisoner and so forth. And in a memo to his superiors, Peake claimed that the US military mission was deployed in Iran to specifically, quote, encourage reform and to urge the adoption of modern, humane techniques of policing, prisons, and general administration. Now, the International Police Academy, which is an institution that was run by the State Department, spent an enormous amount of money training Iranian law enforcement and singled out officers in the Iranian Bureau of Prisons as exemplars of its program, exemplars globally of its program. Nowhere is the evidence of progress in professional competence in global police forces more noticeable, the International Police Academy Review boasted. This is the journal of this academy run by the State Department, than in the national police prison system in Iran. The last few years, this has been completely oriented from a punitive to a modern, psychologically oriented and humane system, end quote. Now, interestingly, this is the language they're using, but in these reports and in all of the sort of archival record, what they say that they're actually training Iranian law enforcement for is riot control. That's the language they use. So at the same time that we're thinking about Savak expanding and sort of surveilling political dissidents, there's also this investment in the gendarmerie to learn sort of modern methods of riot control. He says, Peake tells us this is not just a training thing. An enormous amount of funding, as I said, has gone into it, and he says it's been generous. It has first-rate arms, communications equipment, motor transportation, aircraft, and boats have been given to the Iranians. Whatever failures continue to exist in Iranian prisons and policing, Peake says, are the result of Iranian cultural defects, which he cannot eliminate. So I'm going to wrap up in a minute. I just want to tell you guys a little bit about the technocratic language of modern criminology and the pretense to reforming detainees that kind of remains in the post-revolutionary period. And then I'll just wrap up with a closing thought. Now, after a period of upheaval, after the 1979 revolution, this sort of reformist logic and language, once things sort of are not in that immediate post-revolutionary period, they make an explicit return in the mid to late 80s, even as the repression of political dissidents continues apace. Now, in 1986, the Islamic Republic founds what it calls the Organization of Prisons and National Security Measures to routinize the country's prisons under the aegis of this sort of new Islamic judiciary. So it's been, over the course of the few years before that, attempting to sort of put clerical figures in these judiciary posts, and it takes a few years for it to kind of stabilize. In 1993, this prisons organization establishes a new center, a research center, tasked with conducting prison-related research and training prison personnel. The new prison center promoted its work as an effort to, quote, cure offenders of their social diseases through the most up-to-date knowledge of jail-keeping sciences. So it's a very similar language, right? In 1988, 2 years after its founding, the prisons organization sent several dozen trainees and prison staffers to a new training program at Islamic Azad University in Tehran. It did a series of long-term training courses. It started to fund research in fields of social work, law, and corrections. This program started not modestly, 80 trainees in 93, 94, but by 99, training for personnel was expansive. It was virtually all of the sort of officer-level prison personnel. Courses in psychology, criminology, statistics, penal law, healthcare, first aid, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the Islamic Republic addition to this list is Islamic ethics. They form an archive, a library, they fund research, they have workshops, they are a research center, they're like this. They're maybe having a similar event to what we're having here. You know, it's a proper research center, right? But it's affiliated with the prisons organization. So if you look at some of the best and most, research in top criminology, global criminology journals, and criminal psychology journals, and in all of these different sort of like peer-reviewed scholarly journals, there are myriad articles co-written by like an academic criminologist in the Islamic Republic and a member of the prisons organization. This sort of technocratic language is totally embedded in the fabric of these carceral institutions. So I'm going to stop here, but I want to just so thank you for listening to this long talk. I want to end by just saying, you know, I've tried to show the long roots of the reformist logic that's at the very heart of even building the modern prison system in Iran. I want to make a broader point about that, though, which is that since the very beginning, this reformist language, the idea that most prisoners are capable of reform and cultivation, has not been at all opposed or even in tension with the extraordinary violence of the carceral system in Iran. It is mutually imbricated in that violence, right? It is part and parcel of the logic of the prison. So I want to really, it's not that, my argument is not that, wow, both the Pahlavi government and the Islamic Republic, they tortured despite this promise to kind of a humane treatment, but rather that the logic of being able to transform and change and work on the prisoner to bring someone in and then put them out a different person is I think, part and parcel of the violence of that institution as a kind of at a fundamental level, right? So I want to leave on that point and open it up to questions. Oh, but before I do, I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures. This prison factory from Qasr in 1946. And then this great image from the cover of a pamphlet put out by the Institute for the Cooperation and Industry of Prisoners. And it shows the kind of promise that what happens, the prisoner goes in, he's kind of like sad and hunched over, he's going into the prison. But then when he comes out, he's a new man. He's like standing tall and proud, going to the light of enlightenment. He has a beautiful head of hair, very well dressed. So that is, the kind of, I think this picture, I should have just showed the picture and not spoken for the last 50 minutes. Thank you guys.
Thank you so much. This was such a good talk. sure there are a lot of questions. We don't have terribly much time.
Yeah, sorry.
Of them. So we'll go to Sami first, and then Yuval and Shiragi, and then we'll do right. Keep them short.
Sure. Thank you very much first for sharing your impressive research with us. I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. I have two very quick questions. I wonder, I doubt if we have time to talk about it more. I just want to put it out there. One is that I'm curious to know that if we think of prison and associated with like the modernization program and all these like demands that the modernists had, do we have evidence about people asking and demanding for prisons as a site, as a spatial site for reform, for example, next to Adalat Khane, or having a better educational system? I mean, if you put out what the state did eventually.
Sure. That's a great question. There isn't, the very, very quick answer is not really, not in that way. There isn't demands alongside, for instance, the Adalat Khane demand at the Constitutional Revolution. There isn't a similar demand for like, we want prisons. But intellectuals, at least a very, very small class of intellectuals. So this would be a very small number of people, like ordinary people are not sitting around thinking about this one way or the other, but a small class of intellectuals in the late Qajar period, and I went into this very little, are very concerned with this idea that Iran is lawless, right? And with this idea that that this lawlessness is actually a marker of its civilizational sort of falling behind. So one of the things that's different about, the Iranian criminologists are using very similar language to the European criminologists, but the thing that's different in the Iranian context is this sort of, the context of a sort of colonial anxiety about the sort of power dynamic that exists in this context for these modernist intellectuals, who are in some cases not really that, they're not really excited about the Qajar government either, right? So they see the Qajar government, they use very similar language about the Qajar government that the European, they're not worried about this specific guy getting his sword put into his hand cut off, but they are worried about this idea that it's not, that it's not properly sort of modern. So there are certainly demands for law and the rule of law. That is well established. And prison is just the kind of natural outgrowth of that, what it looks like to have a modern legal order.
Not right now. Later. So I have Milad.
Thank you so much, and important and timely book presentation. So I'm understanding your intervention with broadly sort of Foucauldian emergence of disciplinary society and sort of modern political subjectivity, citizenship, rights, and whatnot, which you sort of highlight. But it's also emergence of modern bourgeois society, responsible selves, bourgeois sexuality, family arrangements, and whatnot. Those who have worked on, let's say, questions of sexuality in Iran, like I'm thinking of Afsan and Ajami's work, have had to contend with the specificity of a Foucauldian thesis and think about the difficulty of the assuming the concepts that Foucauldian apparatus sort of offers us to think about the difficulty of sexuality. So if you were going to, and I'm just kind of thinking yesterday here, the Senate sort of condoned the bourgeois formation of the family through gay marriage, whereas in Iran, questions of gender and sexuality have a very, very
Yeah, absolutely.
So, the account, I guess my question is then about historiography of the prison in Iran.
Right.
And how it sort of folds the prison as part of a global account via Foucault, and then this sort of the specificities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's extremely important question, and one that I try to get at in the book. I'm always trying to figure this question out to some extent, because obviously it should be clear that the work is influenced by Foucault, but I think there are real limitations to the model. I'll start by saying what I take from the Foucauldian model is I think this idea that these new institutions produce new subjectivities, and that they are not simply as, this sort of basic sort of Foucauldian insight that these are not simply repressive institutions, but that they have a kind of creative capacity. Having said that, there's, I think, limitations in a few ways that I try to get at in my work with Foucault. The first is that Foucault, and I say this in the book, he's really not interested in what prisoners do together. For him, the prisoner is this sort of individuated subject of power, right? And so he traces this idea, this sort of discursive work that these criminological discourses do in producing these new subjects. But there is a reality, this is true, it's not only the Iranian specificity, but any prison specificity of a kind of messiness of actual lived experience in those spaces, right? So even in these texts that I'm tracing, this is not like what's happening, Like that is not real. It's total fiction. And so what you do have in the archive is all of this messiness, so you can have anything from what we might think of as political dissidents forming sort of reading groups or exercise groups together, or sort of learning new forms of political belonging in these carceral spaces, but also so-called ordinary prisoners have social worlds, right? And some of them are essentially mafia social worlds. There's like hierarchies, there's who can get you cigarettes, or today a cell phone, or whatever. So there's all of these sort of social worlds that are built in the prisons that I think Foucault is just disinterested in that. For him it would totally complicate theoretically what he's trying to do. But actually the Foucault that is perhaps the most relevant to where my thinking is now. I mean, Discipline and Punish was obviously very informative for me in this work, but Foucault, there was a recent translation of his political writings about prisons. It's called Intolerable. It's this, before he wrote Discipline and Punish, he was part of, with a group of sort of, some of them were still Communist Party members, but they're like kind of post-communist, post-68. This is the break that happens in French intellectual classes after 68. These intellectuals and activists who start organizing around prisoner rights, essentially. And Foucault's very different in that work than he is in Discipline and Punish. In that work, he's actually very much saying that there are social worlds that are built. I am not speaking for these prisoners. I am not calling for reforms because, in fact, the prison is unreformable. It is intolerable. I mean, today we would say that the language is abolitionist, right? Like he is giving you a total critique of what he thinks is a basically like unsalvageable project that is meant to sort of degrade human possibility. But in those works, because there's several incarcerated people who were part of that like group of activists, he's actually interested in like putting out the voices of these incarcerated people who talk about some of these social worlds. So it's a little bit of a different flavor. The way he's still using the same theoretical model, but then he's also telling you that there's this kind of complication, there's this messiness, there's this world that we are imagining as somehow separate from our world, but is actually really mutually imbricated with our world. So that's kind of where I'm trying to get at, where I talk about the public life of the prison, to say that even that, it doesn't just shape the social and shape the public because we're like subjects of power and subjects of discipline, but that there's also a sort of internally a social creativity that comes with repressive systems that's beyond the way that Discipline and Punish at least captures. I am trying to recuperate, I guess if I'm trying to recuperate a Foucault, it's the one that comes through in those political writings, where he's actually much more sort of, wearing his heart on his sleeve about what he thinks is wrong, what he routinely calls intolerable about the situation. And he says again and again that I'm not, people keep asking him like, okay, what do you suggest? What do you propose? And he's like, this is not that kind of project. It's about making visible what's intolerable and also showing you these social worlds you've chosen to ignore. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from now. I hope that.
Try to keep the questions short.
Yeah, I'll try to keep my answers shorter too. I talked a lot. I'm really sorry.
Hopefully the answers for these will be short. But again, thank you for your fascinating talk. I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about what does the prison system and strategies of rehabilitation tell us about the specific and different nation-building projects of the Pahlavi dynasty and the Islamic Republic in terms of
ethnic unity
Mm-hmm.
or religious divide? And related to that, how does the study of incarcerality in this in this context change our understanding of Iranian modernity in terms of, is it a global process that's happening during the late 19th and early 20th century, or is Iranian modernity in this sense largely imported from the West in terms of what the modern state should do in Western eyes?
Yeah, so that's a huge, I'll try to be short. That's an amazing, yeah, no, that's an extremely important, I mean, a really, really, really good question. And in some ways it actually links, I think, to Milad's question, trying to get at, I hear you both as saying something about wanting to get at something, some specificity of what I'm trying to say about Iranian state building modernity, the specificity of these institutions. And the first thing I'll say is that I try to do this in the book, but one thing I would insist on is first going even smaller, making the units smaller. Like, what happens in Qasr doesn't happen in a small regional jail in a small town. I mean, the small jailing facilities in the Islamic Republic today continue to be like, they don't have the same, not only do they not have the factories, but it's like they don't have basic necessities. Like, so when they want to punish a prisoner, mostly typically political dissidents, and they send them to a small, regional jails, they're crumbling, they don't have water, they might not have electricity. So again, there's a sort of a huge gap between thought and expression. Like, if this is the goal, or if this is what's being projected, or this is what is the promise of modernization, there's this gap where there's not even a pretense of actually, it's like, we'll get to those later. So Reza Shah says we're gonna build like 100 new prisons. That's a little bit more than what he says, but they only build a few, and then a few more, and then a few more. So they're constantly trying to catch up. And the major sort of thing that's happening in prisons from the second they're built is overcrowding. It's like, where do we put all these people? We have them now, but we don't know what to do with them. The institutions look different. We'll have to have some of them in the temporary jails, even though they're post-trial. Or whatever. There's just a total messiness about how the system works that goes from the Reza Shah period into the Mohammad Reza Shah period into the Islamic Republic period. Because the prison simply expands much faster and much more exponentially than I think any of these officials imagined that it would.
Are you saying that if you want to go to jail these days, it's better to go to a little one because you'll get treated better instead of
I try, in general, my rule of thumb is to not make pronouncements about what's better and what's worse, because when you make a pronouncement about what you think is better, it like lets that off the hook, even if it's quite grotesque. So I think the goal is to try to not, I mean, you really, these are terrible institutions, and it's similar. What makes the bigger institutions more comfortable is like that they have more access to amenities, but what makes them less comfortable is that there's many, many more like police and security forces, and you're more surveilled. So I guess it depends on your taste. If it's a matter of trying to decide where you'd rather be. For the most part, political dissidents, when they're sent to these smaller facilities, really complain. I mean, they try to get all of the force of their like lawyers and so forth to try to help them be back. Because mostly it's about being able to see their families and having visitation, and there's all these creature comforts they're already cut off from the things that they care about. So no, that's really, but then a lot of one of the interesting things is that we saw in the last 2 years, there were these like essentially COVID riots, but they all happened in these small regional jailing facilities, and there was even escapes because they're not that well. There's not enough people. They're like actually you can escape from them. You really can't escape from the prisons from like Evin. You just can't. Like, it's not feasible. If someone did, I would be really impressed, and I would really want to know how that happened. But there are these, there's these escapes from these jailing facilities that were essentially COVID riots. And they weren't political prisoners. Some of them, they were mostly people on drug charges. Some of them hadn't even been charged yet. They were like held because they didn't have bail. And they just didn't want to get COVID and die. This is like February, March 2020. And so in a way, this is kind of circuitous, but what I want to get at is that there's this sort of idea of a modernization project that both the Pahlavi government and then later the Islamic Republic, albeit in really different terms, have this imagination of a kind of unified structure and project and not only surveillance state, so there's always the surveillance aspect, but even the kind of like, yeah, the national unity, putting people in these same institutions. These are often institutions where people of different ethnic backgrounds, they talk about it in their writing, like, oh, I've never met a, you know, like an ex before. Like, that's so fun, you know? So these are strangely like institutions where people, where there's a kind of social mixing. But there's this kind of lived messiness that it doesn't come out in the official documents. And I think that's actually the sort of push and pull of mass incarceration all over the world, right? That there is this like, this official idea of what prisons are supposed to do, and then there's the lived messiness that sometimes has these creative or even like, you know, things that you think of as kind of beautiful outcomes of these terrible situations, but then the overall effect is one of profound violence, repression, these border-making practices. You know, Omid Tofirian, who is a translator and a scholar in Australia, and he translated Behruz Bouchani's No Friend But the Mountains. He wrote a piece about incarceration, and he calls it a bordering practice, something that builds borders between people, that actually exacerbates tensions. Because, yeah, you see it in the social worlds in prisons. There are, like, different ethnicities have different sort of, like, groupings. And so it's, yeah, I mean, it's if there's not one, I don't have one takeaway about what I think this all means for Iranian modernity, except for to say that I think that Iranian modernity is deeply shaped by these carceral surveillance spaces, and the way that people relate to each other has sort of shifted and been shaped by that as well.
I think we need to be out of the room in a few minutes as class is going to be complete. Maybe we take the last few questions together. If you have any thoughts on that, I think I have 4 now in the back of the room. So why don't we start with you very back and then I'll go over.
So I know you commented briefly on this topic, but my question is about how the emergence of Islamic law after the revolution in this system changed many things, and especially with regard to political prisoners, to the point that paradoxically, like, it was justified after '88 many of the sexual assaults happening in prison. And I'm curious about this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Into that, the whole work program that got constructed in the 1920s, and then now the profitable jails, private jails in U.S. especially. So what is the incentive of keeping more people in because it is profitable and it pays for itself?
Mm-hmm.
Into that, the only side note I want to add is that listening about Iran in 1920 sounds very primitive, because by this time in South Asia, the British Raj had 300,000 police officers. So, you know, it was a whole different world that they were treating and trying to. That was my question: global and profitable.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about capital punishment. What's the thinking?
And one last one to pop on this huge.
Thank you. I think my question was more or less answered, so that's why I was raising my hand. Just touching on the last slides that you put up about reforms and so forth. The first the Iranian prison administrator after the revolution was Sabajavardi. By the way, thank God, the Persian language is full of hyperbole and exaggeration. He referred to every prison as a university. It's a famous quote, like Princeton University, you know, you can imagine. How valid is that claim? Is there any truth to that?
These are huge questions. So I'll try to be very brief. These are great questions. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll start with, I'll come around to the question about the Islamicity and post-revolution with the Lajavardi question. I'll start with the point about following the money and yeah, In the last 10 years or so, from Khamenei down, there's been this kind of anxiety about how many prisoners there are in Iran and the fact that it's unsustainable. It's expensive, they keep building new prisons, but they're just bursting at the seams. And it's mostly on drug-related offenses. So there's been this new effort to not decarceralize, but de-imprison, to not imprison as people for the same offenses, to make bail lower, to change a bunch of things to make there be fewer people in prisons at certain times. And what has happened is that the sort of post-prison carcerality by another name, prison by another name system, things like ankle monitors and so forth, those are monetized and extremely expensive, just like they are here. So here, one thing we don't maybe know is that if you're like you've been released and you're on an ankle monitor and you're at home, you have to pay for your ankle monitor, an enormous amount of money. But if you can't leave your house to work, you're just in this impossible situation, right? And a very similar thing holds in Iran. There isn't the same kind of, there is prison labor, but it doesn't pay for itself. It's not the way that private prison practices is here. But there is this effort to try to, to monetize these other systems. As far as there's an effort to sort of Islamicize law after the revolution. And in some ways it's a massive failure in the sense that the actual law governing these institutions has to be borrowed, as I said, in many cases from the pre-revolutionary period. Having said that, the sort of ideological orientation and the sort of moral orientation of the government imagines itself as the sort of arbiter of what is Islamically just. And that has enormous ramifications on how prisoners are treated, including political dissidents, and the sort of capacity of the government to, you brought up 1988, and I think that's a perfect example, right? That it's not so much about what the institutions are or what the law says, so much as, for me, as what is this kind of ideologically oriented idea, such that you have the idea, not just Islamic, but revolutionary. So you have these post-revolution figures, someone like Khalkhali, saying counter-revolutionaries have to be destroyed, but counter-revolutionaries includes not only dissidents, but drug users, sex workers. He says specifically, if you're a bazaar merchant who's price gouging, you're counter-revolutionary and you need to be destroyed. So the idea of what is the criminal becomes also an idea of who is counter-revolutionary, who is un-Islamic. So yeah, there's this total shift in the ideological language that that sort of marks the governing state. And it's not the same throughout these last 45 years. It also has changed in that time. And then as far as capital punishment, I don't totally know what you mean by, like, what's the thinking? It's the same thinking as exists here, that it's Iran and the United States are basically two of the most sort of use the death penalty more than almost any other governments. They're also two of the most heavily carceral governments in the world. The United States is much more carceral than Iran in the sense of the raw numbers. And I think the thinking is that the logic that's given is that it makes society safer. The reality is that that's not the case. So, yeah. I think I answered the questions.
On that note, please join me.
Yeah.